Hi, this is Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. And today, we're going to be talking about something that is more important than mixing, potentially. This is something that gets overlooked, I think, in a lot of projects that are pretty good, but don't have the kind of final polish that they really expect out of their favorite commercial releases. It's a missing ingredient for a lot of people that a lot of people who have great chops in other areas don't take as seriously as they should, that so many of their biggest favorite records take very, very seriously. What is this missed part of the post-production record making prior to mixing process that I'm talking about? Man, there's so many things that are potentially more important than mixing. The performance for one, right? The song for another, right? These are probably the indisputed king and queen of what makes a recording good. But the thing I'm going to talk about right now, the word sounds a little bit boring, but we're going to try to make the subject sexy today because it should be sexy in your mind because it has so much of an impact, potentially a way bigger impact than some $10,000 microphone or outboard piece of gear or fancy converter. And that is your editing. And your editing can make your music sound so much more expensive, so much more well executed, and most importantly, so much more emotionally impactful. It can also make things sound more streamlined, tighter, more cohesive. And there's a few things to look for in good editing. And there's a lot of things you could talk about when you talk about editing. We could be talking about song selection, editing what songs are actually going to go on the record. That's a certain form of editing, right? Kind of pre-production form of editing. If you go back to the Motown days of Berry Gordy making records, he'd throw people in a room together, have a whole bunch of people write and arrange a whole bunch of different songs, and then pick the best ones and really only record those, right? Like that's part of an editing process. But the editing I'm going to be talking about today is the slightly dorkier, more minutia type of editing of sliding things around in your DAW. Or for the two of you left in the world who are editing on tape machines, splicing with an X-Acto knife and scotch taping things back together as we used to do in days of yore. All right, let's get into this topic. I'm going to tell you exactly why this is so important, how to do it right, how to know if you should be doing slightly more editing than you are now, what are some of the most important areas to edit, and when and why to leave things alone. I know I'm going to get some pushback from those people who say, I don't want to do any editing. We want totally natural live performances. And yeah, there's something to be said for that some of the time. But what I'm thinking of is on so many records that come through for mastering, every once in a while, people ask me for mix advice. And sometimes their mix will be really good, but what's holding it back are slight editing things in the performance that could tighten things up and make the mix sound literally 2 to 3 times better by not changing a single thing in the mix. Every once in a while, the best mixing advice I can give people who are asking for mixing advice, who are mastering clients, is actually editing advice. And I want to bring up some of the most common things there with a few specific examples. And I think this one's going to be helpful for you. Before we get into it, the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. Big thanks once again this month to one of my favorite makers of plugins in the known universe. If you have been checking out this podcast for some length of time, you probably know who it's going to be. Who do you think it is? It's Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects around. Just get the whole Sound Toys 5 bundle if you don't have it already. And if you don't love their stuff, it's probably because you haven't tried it. But you can get the best free trial in the whole plugin business, 30 days to try out all of their stuff over at soundtoys.com. So check them out. Tell them we sent you. Also, big shout out and thanks to Focusrite, making some of the best value and interfaces out there from the entry-level Scarlett line. Also, they make great high-end stuff all the way up to their high-end RedNet series. So check them out at Focusrite.com. One last shameless plug. We've also got the full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs that will help you mix more confidently, faster, and with better results than ever before, giving you a real roadmap and plan of attack for mixing over at mixingbreakthroughs.com, or my full-length course on mastering over at masteringdemystified.com, where you can learn literally everything I know about mastering. If you want something totally for free, we've also got some free workshops like the 5 habits of every great mixer over at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. These are the 5 things that all of the best mixers that I have studied, interviewed, produced masterclasses with, worked alongside. These are the 5 things that basically all of them do in every single one of their mixes. And if you start doing these 5 things too, your mixes are going to improve dramatically pretty much overnight. Definitely check it out, sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. Or if you want something on mastering, a free primer, check out Mastering 101 over at sonicscoop.com/mastering 101. Okay, into this week's episode. And this was inspired a little bit by actually my own brother has been having some more success lately as a film composer, and he's been scoring more and more films that have been having some success, some award nominations and some award wins, and picking up more and more work there. And he was showing me some stuff for his reel, some cues he'd been working on, and asking me for mixing advice. Hey, Justin, what can I do to improve these mixes at the scale that I'm working at? A lot of the composers are having to mix all of their own stuff, and in some cases master all their own stuff, depending on the budget of the picture. So I've got to get this area of my chops down. What can you tell me about? Here's a few of my favorite cues and what could be improved in the mix. And I've got to tell you, his mixes were actually pretty darn good. There's a lot of musicians out there these days doing better and better mixes. And there weren't a lot of huge problems with the level balances and things. But one of the tracks stood out to me for being one of the most beautiful, sophisticated arrangements in there, but one that was falling short of its potential. And it wasn't because of any problems in the mix. It was from something right before the mix, that editing stage of getting things slightly more into sync. And this is especially important when you're not talking about bands that play together constantly. Like you take Black Sabbath in like 1969, and there are a bunch of people in their early 20s who have been playing together every night, and you just put them on a stage and record them, and it sounds perfect. There's no editing required. It's awesome. But that is not the way most people are making music today. They're often doing it in kind of more piecemeal collaboration. They're not the same players playing the same songs again and again and again, getting super tight. Not a lot of people are necessarily making the kind of jazz stuff where things are meant to be really loose, and, you know, the ebb and flow of things is kind of intentional. And these are seasoned players who are playing 2 hours a day every day. So they're really, editing would defeat the purpose of what they're doing. For the kind of popular music releases that so many and most of us are working on, a little bit of editing is not just a good idea, but often required to get the kinds of sounds that are going to stand up to your favorite releases. And in this particular track, what was holding it back a little bit was just the downbeats of different instruments not hitting precisely every once in a while on the downbeat all together. And this happened because, to a degree, they couldn't do this straight to a click. They're trying to kind of match picture. So you had different performers playing to previously recorded tracks, trying to match the feel of what's going on screen. So it's not totally on a grid because there's some elements in the actual picture that you have to match. But this could come up a lot with bands that play together, whether it's to a click on a grid or not. You can have moments where that kick drum is a little bit too early. That kick drum is a little bit too late. It's not hitting in sync with the bass. It's not hitting in sync with the guitar. There's a snare drum hit that's a little bit late. Now, there are times where having things be a little bit early, a little bit late, you just leave them alone. And we'll get into that in a second. But often when I find people comparing their work to these amazing sounding records that they absolutely love, one of the things that's holding them back from getting all of the way there is that precision. And it doesn't necessarily mean you go and beat quantize everything exactly to the grid. There are 2 overall approaches to editing. And one of them is quantizing everything to the grid, treating it like it's electronic music and just getting it spot onto the grid. And that's actually a valid approach and a valid way of working. And there are great records that are made in that way. And a lot of big pop releases are almost metronomic in their consistency. where they are on the grid again and again and again. And you don't necessarily have to emulate that if that's not the feel you're going for. But there are times where you're trying to make a record that's supposed to sound sophisticated and well executed and impressive and intentional and have a lot of force and weight behind it. And when things, just a few hits, aren't consistently together, it loosens everything up. And in this particular cue, things were getting a little bit more of like Soundtrack to Juno, the Moldy Peaches. I was a fan of the Moldy Peaches before anyone knew about the Moldy Peaches. I saw them opening up for the Strokes back in the early 2000s. I'm old. Man, that must have been back in 2001. And it's not to single them out, or make fun of their performance. It's, really charming. And there are times where being out of time is going to evoke the mood that you want to. But when things are supposed to sound impressive or immersive or foreboding or whatever it might be, there's this degree of tightness that really needs to be there to make things really create their own world and to help you to some degree forget about the performance a little bit and just immerse yourself in the world of the song. Amazing musicians, particularly those who play together regularly, are able to do this kind of potentially naturally without much editing. But modern record production, even those musicians will often be edited to some degree. And if you don't want to go through that approach of taking everything and putting it right on the grid, which is not appropriate for a lot of styles of music, it comes down to finding the things that are holding back the track and then pulling them together. And I'm going to give you just the most obvious things to look at. And number one is the kick drum. So number one offender when a lack of editing is holding back the track is the kick drum. And this happens in two different ways. One, it's going to be timing. But two, it can also be dynamics. So one of two things can go wrong when a kick drum is out of time, right? It can be a little bit too early, giving things a bit of a rushed feel, or it can be too late, giving things this lagging, slowing down feel. And that can actually be okay. If your kick drum is consistently ahead of the beat, that can actually be awesome. And that can be an awesome, tasteful decision the drummer makes. Or if your kick drum is consistently behind the beat, that can also be this awesome decision that the musician's making just to make things feel a little bit sludgier. So a drummer can make things sound perkier by being ahead of the beat, sludgier by being behind the beat. The problem is when it's inconsistent, whether they're ahead of the beat, behind the beat, or on beat. And when you're doing this kind of editing, you want to think about what is the dominant mode that this drummer was trying to be in? What was the thing that they were trying to convey? Or what should they have been trying to convey? Should they be right on the beat? Should they be a slightly ahead of the beat, slightly behind the beat? You basically pick which of those is appropriate and then make all of them feel intentionally the same way. So editing that's done well doesn't necessarily making everything perfect and smoothing them out. It means making what the player's doing feel more intentional and more masterful. And it means not detracting from their musicality, but enhancing their musicality and adding to their musicality by taking their intention and taking the actual human thing that they were trying to express and just help them express it more consistently, more masterfully. And that's how to go about editing when you want to do it lightly. The other thing that can happen is the dynamics can be inconsistent. And this is something that separates a lot of good mixes that are being held back a little bit from their favorite references and favorite releases that they're not quite living up to. And that is how tight that kick drum is. And you could try to tighten up the dynamics with compressors and with limiters, and that's totally an option. The other way to do it is with editing. And the best way to do it with editing is by creating your own samples. That's way number one, where at the end of a recording session, you say to the drummer, let's do a few quarter note hits on the snare drum, a few quarter note hits on the kick drum. I just want to capture a few good hits at a few good levels so I can make samples of your performance and bring them back in. Or potentially, if the bleed is under control and manageable, taking a kick hit from a different part of the performance and then bringing it in. That isn't always possible. And one thing that's very popular in a lot of really big releases is sample replacement or sample augmentation with commercially available samples or samples that you've made yourself and put into your own library. And that idea of doing, in most cases, probably not sample replacement if you're looking for a more human band feel, but sample augmentation, of taking what they played and supporting it with a really consistent dynamic hit, thinking of it almost like a parallel compressed track that's piggybacking on their performance. And I'd say this is one of the biggest things, how consistent your kick hits are in timing and in dynamics. Are they falling in the same part of the beat, whether that's ahead or behind or right on consistently? And are they at a consistent level and tone each time? Sometimes needing sample replacement or sample augmentation to help assist you in this. And remember, it is okay for things not to all be hitting on the grid at the same exact time together. Sometimes when you have one instrument that's slightly ahead of the beat, one that's on the beat, and one that's behind the beat, and they all hit together, it kind of extends out that hit. And instead of making a tight bump, it becomes this bigger bump. It's just a slight change, a slight difference in tonality by having several instruments spread out. But the idea of them being consistently in the same spot is big. There's this saying that a old professor of mine from back in my college days, a guy named Jim McElwain said. He said, if you ever make a mistake when you're playing, make it again. And that's one of the biggest ways to make things sound right, is to do it wrong again and again and again. So again, late hits, early hits, whatever can be great as long as they sound willful and intentional. It's like Pee Wee Herman falling off his bicycle and saying, I meant to do that. You don't say the I meant to do that part out loud, but if you can make people think that you meant to make the mistake by repeating it, it doesn't sound like a mistake anymore. It sounds like intention. It becomes intention. And that's really what mastery is do your results match your intentions, or at least appear to? So that's something that good editing can help you with. All right, the next big component for editing is bass. Sometimes when kick is edited, bass needs to be edited along with it. And the same thing happens with level on bass, where again, you can try to really compress or limit the bejesus out of a bass. That is a totally valid approach, and it can work, often splitting the bass track into multiple parts and compressing them separately based on their frequency ranges. But sometimes going in there and sliding a bass note left or right and sliding its volume again up and down, that's another big part of editing, is dynamics editing, not just timing editing, can be absolutely big in making the whole performance, the whole band, and the whole musical world sound like this really cohesive and impressive whole. After that, the same exact kind of things on snare drum. Not only is the snare drum, is it in the right place, but is the dynamics and the tone of that snare drum appropriate? And because this is often difficult to do really well with the kinds of bleed that might be going on in a real performed kit, this is one of the things that makes sample replacement and sample augmentation so popular, is that you can move things around a little bit more without showing the seams and without making it sound as edited. Now, some of you are going to say, but this is awful, this is evil, this is what's ruining music. And it depends on what kind of music you're talking about, because some kinds of music, it makes those genres possible. Like, this goes back decades, like a Tears for Fears record. How old are Tears for Fears now? This music that's like 30 or 40 years old now that still resonates with people. Should that stuff sound like sloppy and off grid, or should it sound super, super tight? It should probably sound super, super tight. And if you're going to tell me Tears for Fears records are bad, that's because you're wrong. So let's just get that happening, right? And hip hop, EDM, so many genres should feel really tight. But it's not just that. Really organic genres where the musician should live and breathe together and they want very little editing. Well, that editing still needs to happen. It just doesn't happen after the recording. It happens before the recording. And that editing is called rehearsing and practicing and rehearsing the bejesus out of things. You've got to be the kind of musician who's willing to play your instrument for at least 30 minutes a day, 6 days a week, if not as much as at least 2 hours a day, 7 days a week. Past that, you'll get diminishing returns. But if you're that kind of person who really has that dedication to your instrument and your craft, and you're constantly playing, then yes, you can make mistakes that sound awesome and expressive, because you will develop mastery and you will play around with where you want things to hit on the beat, and it'll sound rad. However, even if you're that kind of musician, there are certain types of aesthetics and certain types of records that you might want to be involved with that still want to be edited because they give it a specific kind of feel. So even great musicians, depending on the aesthetic that you're going for and depending on the production style, even amazing musicians, editing can be warranted as a creative choice. But if you're not the kind of musician who is there woodshedding at least 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, if not 2 hours a day, 7 days a week, and not playing with the same band again and again, and you're comparing your records to like chart-topping hits, chances are those chart-topping hits had a lot of editing going into them. And if you're saying, why am I falling short of some of these favorite records? And you're looking for the answer in preamps and right compressor settings and things like that, that's not where all the answer lies. A lot of what makes those records sound impressive is the rhythmic cohesion, the dynamic cohesion, and a good portion of that, whether you like it or not, comes from editing. So you got 3 choices here. Make homespun and intentionally homespun sounding stuff that is supposed to sound rickety and rough around the edges. That type of music often finds a smaller audience, possibly because it's easier to make, but it can be extremely charming and extremely awesome. And maybe that's what you should be doing. And you shouldn't be comparing yourself to these, big chart topping releases. And that's one great answer. Another great answer is you be the kind of musician, you play with the kinds of musicians where you're constantly playing and hopefully constantly playing together live. And you're a band like Snarky Puppy or something like that, to just give you a modern example, where it's all about playing together. Amazing people like Jacob Collier or something. If you ever see him perform live, I mean, it's a musician's musician, right? Like there are absolute music nerd people who you might never want to edit their performances. But even some of those people in the right context might still do some editing depending on what they're going for. Then your third option, and this is the most appropriate option for probably most people who are listening to this, who are like into music production and into making records sound great and cool. And that is do some damn editing. Get over it. Like it's part of the process. Edit those kick drums, edit those basses, edit those snares, in particular, if you don't want to edit everything. You don't necessarily have to micromanage them, but you want to listen through and take notes and say, verse 2, second bar, that kick hit, that one is late. It's something I'm listening for now. And I feel how it doesn't line up the same as the other one. So we're going to slide that one a little earlier. And take notes. And this is what I'd recommend is don't just go into the grid. You can do this, but don't just go in there and start going down each kick. If you want to do the minimalist approach to editing, that approach begins with listening, taking notes, and finding the things that need to be fixed, and then going and fixing them. And then once you've fixed all of those things, listen to the entire song again and take notes to see if anything else now stands out. And that's how the minimalist approach to editing really works. The other approach to editing, when you really want to create a finely tuned, like Swiss watch of a song, you want to make the next Britney Spears Toxic, which is an awesome song, by the way, even if you don't like Britney Spears, that's going to require like being 100% on the grid and maybe even thinking in terms of loops or slicing up drum kits and like making them into loops or making them into individual hits. There are certain production styles that really want to be that tight. So Of course, there are places to quibble here, and I hope you do. Tell me why I'm wrong in the comments down below. I hope I get some angry answers on this one. I probably will. And if I don't, it's because I've done something wrong. So some people tell me why you shouldn't edit, but give me your thoughts. When should you edit? When shouldn't you? Do you think I've given you the 3 kind of primary modalities here for ways to think about editing and your solution to this whole problem? Or do you have another possible solution here? When has editing saved your butt, or when has it gone horribly wrong for you? I want to hear all about it in the comments down below. Or if you're in an audio only version and like sending me emails, you can email me over at podcast@sonicscoop.com. If you've made it this far, you probably like hearing me talk for some reason and giving advice on audio. And I do that professionally, and I can help you get even better at your craft. I have some free stuff I want to offer you. I've got the 5 habits of every great mixer. I've spent more than the past decade studying the best mixers in the business, looking under the hoods of their sessions, working under them, working alongside them, interviewing them, producing master classes with them. And these are the 5 common threads that hold all of the work together. And if you implement these 5 simple, easy habits in your work right now, it will dramatically improve. Chances are you do not do all 5 of these things, but almost every single one of the best mixers does. You can get that for free over at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits for the 5 habits of every great mixer. If you prefer something that's on mastering, I've got a primer, an intro to mastering for you. Tell you everything you need to know about the mastering process in brief. You can get that Mastering 101. Check out that free workshop at sonicscoop.com/mastering 101. If you prefer to go super deep and change the way that you mix forever, for the better, we've got the full-length course, Mixing Breakthroughs. Get that at mixingbreakthroughs.com. It's got a money-back guarantee, and it will help you mix more confidently, more efficiently, more quickly, and with better results than ever before, without second guessing yourself and without getting to like mix version 9, final, revision 2, final, number 8. That will be a problem of the past when you actually implement what's in Mixing Breakthroughs. Is that like overselling this? No. It is going to give you a system and a roadmap for mixing that's really going to improve the way you do everything. If you prefer to find out everything I know about mastering in the premium full-length course, you can check that out over at masteringdemystified.com, where you'll learn literally everything that I know about mastering. Big shout out and thanks not only to you, but to our sponsors. Soundtoys, sponsoring this podcast from the beginning. Check them out over at soundtoys.com, where you can try out any of their awesome creative mixing effects for 30 days, totally for free at soundtoys.com. Big shout out and thanks also to Focusrite, sponsoring the podcast again this month, making some of the best value and interfaces out there, from the entry-level Scarlett series all the way up to the high-end RedNet series for outfitting major institutions, major recording studios, and the like. Big thanks again to you for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop. See you next time.